Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. You know how we often hear about price wars in business? Well, today we're really digging into what the Economist has called China's pervasive price wars. It seems like it's totally reshaping major industries, from electric cars to solar panels, and it's leading to some truly surprising outcomes for their economy.
That's right, yeah. The Economist article paints a pretty stark picture. They use this term involution, which is basically overcompetition getting out of hand.
Right.
Where brutal price cutting is just destroying profit margins across these really critical sectors like EVs, batteries, solar panels, even heavy industry.
Okay.
And the way the article frames it, this is seen as a major problem, something Beijing is actively trying to fix.
And the fix sounds familiar, doesn't it?
Yeah.
A bit like a rerun of that 2015 Supplyside crackdown.
Exactly. They talk about things like capacity quotas, forcing mergers, tighter environmental standards, very much like what happened with steel and coal a few years back. And they also float reviving the housing market sort of as a way to absorb some of this excess industrial output. It's a clear narrative.
It is, yeah. But you're saying there's more to it.
Well, yeah, here's where it gets really interesting. Since The Economist actually went to press, we've seen new data come out. And this data, it not only confirms those deflationary pressures they talked about, but it also kind of exposes several, let's say, crucial blind spots in that original framing.
Okay, blind spots. Let's unpack that. What kind of numbers are we seeing that challenge that initial view?
Okay, so for starters, the Producer Price Index, the PPI, it just dropped for its 32nd consecutive month.
32, wow.
Yeah, I mean, that's almost 3 years of falling factory gate prices.
Right.
And it hit -3.3% year on year in May. So it's not just there, it's deepening significantly.
Nearly 3 years.
Yeah.
That really underlines just how persistent this deflationary pressure is. What about specific sectors? You mentioned EVs, where we hear so much about fierce competition.
Absolutely. In the EV market, the average discount off the sticker price hit a record high, 16.8% in May.
16.8%.
Yeah, think about that. Almost 17% off the listed price. That goes straight to the manufacturer's margins, obviously.
Well, that's a huge saving for consumers, maybe, but clearly not great for the car maker's bottom line.
Yeah.
Are we actually seeing companies cut back production, though?
They are, yeah. Take BYD, a huge player in EVs. Their domestic output, just looking at April and May, was down 29% compared to Q4 2024.
29%. That's substantial.
It's a strong signal. Firms are cutting shifts, delaying expansion plans, and look at solar module prices are down 30% year on year. And here's a really startling figure. China's solar manufacturing capacity. It's now estimated to be more than double total global demand.
Double global demand. That's that's mind-boggling overcapacity right there.
It really is.
And then there's the housing market. The Economist suggested it could be part of the solution. How's that looking?
Well, not great, frankly. New home prices still down 4.5% year on year. That drag from the property sector, it just persists. No real signs of a quick rebound.
Right.
And then adding to all this domestic pressure, you've got those new EU provisional tariffs on Chinese EVs. They range between, 17 and 38%?
Big range.
Yeah, and that squeezes export outlets, right? It limits China's ability to just sort of ship its way out of this overcapacity problem.
So, okay, the picture emerging now feels much more intense, much more complex than maybe even the Economist's initial analysis captured.
Yeah.
Which makes me wonder about some of their core assumptions. Like, the article often seems to frame these price wars as almost policy accidents, like Beijing is just reacting, firefighting. Is that the full story?
Our analysis suggests maybe not. It's possible Beijing actually views this kind of controlled deflation, particularly in green tech, as a strategic feature, not purely a bug.
A feature. How so?
Well, think about it. Ultra-cheap EVs and solar modules, they're not just good for Chinese consumers getting affordable tech. They could profoundly accelerate China's own domestic climate agenda.
Well, okay, right. Hit their targets faster.
Exactly. And strategically undercut foreign rivals on the global stage. And look, it's not just a hunch. We saw official subsidies to listed firms actually fell 13% year on year in 2024.
Fell, not rose.
Fell, which kind of hints at maybe a managed retreat from subsidies, a more calculated move rather than some desperate across-the-board bailout.
Huh. That does put a different spin on it. So if it's perhaps a more deliberate strategy, or at least has strategic elements, How does that change the outlook for solutions? Can Beijing really just, rerun those 2015 supply-side reforms like the economist suggested?
That seems difficult. The context is just completely different now. Back then, it was mostly about lumbering state-owned enterprises, SOEs, in sectors like steel and coal.
Right. Easier targets, maybe?
Yeah. Arguably, yeah. Today's excess capacity sectors like EVs and batteries, they're led by these really nimble, innovative private firms. Forcing these companies to just idle production lines, it risks stalling the very innovation cycle that keeps China at the tech frontier. Consider BYD, they have an impressive 22% gross margin right now.
22% despite the price wars.
Exactly. And that margin is funding critical R&D, things like next-gen solid-state batteries.
So forcing cuts could actually slow down their own technological progress in key areas.
Precisely. And you add in the multiplying global trade barriers. Making deep cuts at home could actually end up handing market share to foreign competitors rather than strengthening China's national champions. It's a very delicate balancing act for them.
That's a really crucial point. And, okay, what about the property market? That traditional sort of safety valve for absorbing industrial slack, the economists hinted it could be revived. Is that truly feasible, do you think, in the current climate?
It looks increasingly unlikely to be a major fix. The housing weakness seems really structural now. We're talking about fundamental things like shrinking household formation rates.
Demographics.
Yeah, demographics, exactly. Plus really high down payment ratios making it hard for new buyers, and this huge legacy of unfinished property projects hanging over the market. Even that slight stabilization in new home prices back in March, it just flattened out what was still a 4.5% annual decline.
So still falling year on year.
Still falling. And land sale revenues for local governments, they just hit a decade low. So it's really hard to imagine a rapid property rebound big enough to soak up all this industrial overcapacity anytime soon.
Okay, so that traditional solution looks shaky. Which brings us to another assumption. The idea that this overcapacity is purely a domestic issue for China to sort out internally. Is that really accurate?
No, not at all. The reality is the complaints coming from the West about this very issue, they actually mirror Beijing's own stated concerns sometimes. You have the U.S. Treasury, the EU, both openly citing Chinese green tech overproduction as a strategic threat to their own industries.
Which is exactly why we're seeing those new tariffs being discussed and imposed, right?
Exactly right. And this global pushback, it significantly limits China's ability to simply, export its deflation, as the saying goes.
Right. Can't just dump the excess goods elsewhere easily.
Which effectively tightens the noose on margins back home. The pressure just builds up internally instead.
That sounds like a tough bind. Okay, and then there's maybe the biggest one. This underlying idea that deflation is automatically, unambiguously bad. When we hear deflation, we usually think economic stagnation, maybe even crisis. But is it always the case here?
That's a great question. It's definitely more nuanced than just deflation bad. I mean, yes, falling prices can signal weak demand. But think about what is deflating. Cheaper batteries, cheaper solar panels, cheaper EVs. These things are indeed deflationary in price terms, but they're also profoundly productivity enhancing.
Okay, so cheaper inputs, more efficiency.
Exactly.
Yeah.
What does this mean for you listening? It potentially means the world's massive decarbonization bill gets smaller faster. And for Chinese consumers, it means they gain purchasing power in these key green technology areas, making the transition more accessible.
Right.
So the real challenge might be less about just propping up prices at all costs and more about figuring out how to redistribute the gains from this increased productivity domestically. Maybe, boosting household incomes, strengthening social safety nets, that kind of thing.
That's a really important distinction. It shifts the focus, doesn't it, from just stopping price drops to managing the consequences, both good and bad, of this rapid technological advance and efficiency gain. So if we try and connect all these different threads, what's truly fascinating, it seems, is that China appears to be running almost two industrial strategies at the same time.
That's a very astute way to put it, yeah. On one hand, you see actions that look like deliberately flooding these green tech value chains, trying to seize global scale, become the dominant player, be the world's factory for the green transition.
Aggressive industrial policy, basically.
But then, on the other hand, you have Beijing talking about curbing involution, talking about reining in these price wars.
So this contradiction, maybe it isn't necessarily a mistake or confusion. It sounds more like political theater almost.
Yeah.
Aimed at different audiences.
It certainly could be interpreted that way. One message for local officials who are incentivized to chase investment and production targets, keep GDP growing locally. and another message for trading partners abroad who are accusing Beijing of dumping products and unfair competition. It allows them to maintain a narrative of control and concern while still pursuing pretty aggressive industrial goals.
Okay, so what this suggests then is that this deflation, these price wars, they're less a simple battle and more a symptom of what? Rapid productivity growth colliding head-on with weak domestic demand and these increasingly hostile export markets.
Absolutely. That seems like a core dynamic. And if that's the case, a supply-side fix alone, just cutting capacity, it can't really solve a fundamental shortfall of purchasing power within China.
Right.
And as we just discussed, a property market rebound isn't likely to ride to the rescue either, given the structural issues like demographics and the need for households to kind of repair their balance sheets after years of focusing on real estate.
Which brings us, it seems, to a really awkward spot for Beijing, almost like a policy trilemma, where they're stuck between three difficult choices.
That's a good way to frame it. A trilemma. First, they can curb capacity, really force cuts in production. But as we said, that risks losing their hard-won green tech edge and global market share.
Okay, option one, risky.
Option two, they can just keep scaling, keep expanding production, keep pushing down the cost curve. But that probably deepens the price war at home and almost certainly invites even more foreign tariffs and trade friction abroad.
Option two, also risky. What's the third?
The third way is to stoke demand significantly within China, really boost domestic consumption. But that would likely entail costly fiscal transfers, major social welfare reforms. Things Beijing has, frankly, long delayed and seems historically reluctant to implement on the massive scale that might be needed.
So curb capacity and risk innovation, keep scaling and risk trade wars, or stoke demand and face major fiscal and political shifts. None of those sound easy.
Not at all.
So what's the likely path forward then, given these challenging options? Are we expecting a bold move from Beijing, or is it more likely to be muddling through?
Well, judging by past patterns and the current complexities, we're probably looking at incrementalism. More cautious steps. Expect maybe softer measures, things like encouraging voluntary self-discipline pledges among companies in certain sectors.
Right, trying to coordinate price floors, maybe?
Sort of, yeah. Maybe faster bankruptcy clearances for really struggling firms to get capacity offline that way. Perhaps some selective export subsidies to help specific companies push more goods abroad despite tariffs. And authorities will likely continue testing modest demand-side tools like small cuts to mortgage rates or limited consumer voucher programs.
But not the big bazooka on demand.
Probably not immediately. Anything bolder, like a fundamental shift towards boosting household income and consumption as the primary growth driver, would require Beijing to really concede that China's basic growth model needs a major overhaul. And that debate seems very much unresolved at the highest levels, inside Zhongnanhai.
Okay, so summing up, The Economist is definitely right that China's price wars signal a deeper economic challenge, a malaise. But perhaps what our look into the wider picture reveals is that the original article might underplay the potential strategic motives behind some of this overcapacity. And maybe it overstates how easily those old 2010s-era supply curbs or a quick property revival could actually rescue corporate profits this time around.
That feels like the bottom line, yes. Unless Beijing finds a way to really tackle that domestic demand shortfall head-on, perhaps, by genuinely letting wages rise faster, implementing more redistribution, boosting service sector productivity, then this intense competition, this involution, it might not just be a temporary war. It could actually be part of the new normal for China as a super competitive industrial powerhouse operating in a more challenging global environment.
And that, of course, has huge implications, not just for China's own economy, but for global trade patterns, international relations, and importantly, for the pace and cost of decarbonization efforts worldwide. It leads us to the question, really. What aspects of this complex picture do you think will end up impacting the global economy most directly in the coming years?